Update 5.2 is the biggest patch yet to come to Battlefield 5. While the most controversial aspects of it, weapon balance and spotting changes, have already been detailed by DICE, and the community has had an opportunity to react to them, another massive area of change has yet to be properly detailed by DICE. Update 5.2 will be bringing massive changes to tanks and anti-tank weaponry for the sake of both better balancing tanks amongst themselves, but also their interactions with infantry. So in today's video, we'll be covering the major changes to tanks and anti-tank weaponry, as well as how they will be affecting game balance and game meta. A massive shout out to Azura Gaming at this stage, as while the data does come directly from DICE, it is actually him who put it all together and subsequently analysed and published it both privately and publicly in Reddit and in a video of his own. You'll find links to both his YouTube and Twitter down below. If you're interested in any sort of vehicular combat in Battlefield 5, you'll find some fantastic content over there to enjoy. Starting off then with what is most likely to affect all players, the infantry anti-tank weaponry. We have various changes to AT mines, dynamite, Panzerfaust and more, as their damage, usage and intended role is changing in the coming 5.2 update. As regards AT mines and dynamite, they will now have a 100% chance of disabling the track or engine of a tank if that tank rolls over them. AT mines, of which 3 can be carried and 6 actually placed down, will no longer primarily be intended for actually killing tanks, instead immobilizing them. It is very much still possible to take out a tank, but it will require more than the 3 mines you can actually carry without resupplying and placing down some more. As regards reference values for maximum damage, mines will be able to do a maximum of 28 damage per mine to a light tank, 25 against medium tanks, and 20 against a heavy tank. Dynamite in turn will be able to still do significantly more damage with a maximum of 42 for light tanks, 38 to medium, and 30 to heavy tanks, but much like the mines is no longer solely focused on actually physically taking out tanks, but instead immobilizing them first. As regards the projectile-based anti-tank weaponry, against a medium tank for reference sake, the AT pistol will be doing a minimum of 6 damage when hitting at a ricochet angle, 9 damage for normal shots, and 22 for a critical shot to the engine. We will explain those different hits and the angles they occur at in just a moment later on in the video. The Panzerfaust will be doing a little bit more damage on the other hand, with a minimum of 8, normal damage at 11, and critical hits to the engine netting you 25 damage flat. The Piat, likely to become more popular following this update, will be doing a minimum of 15 damage in the worst case scenarios, 21 damage normally, and 45 damage with the perfect shot to the rear of a tank. With the gadgetry though out of the way, on the angle of impact and damage multipliers, in the current build of Battlefield 5, the amount of damage an incoming projectile can actually deal is dependent on the angle at which it collides with its target. This is because the actual damage a projectile does is the result of a relatively complicated equation, including both impact damage and blast damage of the projectile. Now, the impact damage of a projectile is in turn affected by a multiplier from close to 0 all the way up to 2 in the current build of the game, which is determined by the angle at which the projectile actually hits the tank and what part of the tank is being hit, alongside what tank is being hit. While this still very much will be the case after update 5.2, instead of a gradual drop off of the multiplier and thus damage, there will be fixed angles at which you can either score a ricochet, normal hit, or critical hit. Further, the multiplier of the ricochet hits will be less punishing, resulting in a higher minimum damage value even when your shot lands at a difficult angle. You saw this earlier with the Panzerfaust, which no longer has a minimum damage of essentially 1 at a ricochet angle, but the same applies to tank fire projectiles in the form of traditional HE or AP shells. What this of course means in practice is somewhat helpfully illustrated by one of Azura's visuals. Looking specifically at the Panzer IV, for example, the German medium tank, it's important to note that these multiplier models are actually different for both each tank and each side of a tank. Thus, shooting the Panzer IV from the front will only result in a critical hit at an angle of 80% or greater, almost perfectly perpendicular, which in turn will then apply a 1.5 multiplier to the amount of impact damage your shell is doing. A normal hit is achieved between the angles of 30 to 80 degrees at the front with a 1x multiplier, and shots angled at less than 30 degrees will result in so-called ricochet shots and thus have a multiplier applied to them of roughly 0.5 or 0.6. When it comes to the sides, things are similar in that an 80% or greater angle will actually net you a critical hit, this time however resulting in a 2x multiplier for the impact of your projectile, but things at the back are significantly more dangerous. When shooting the rear of a tank, there's a critical hit to be scored at an angle of 60 or greater, thus significantly more forgiving than the sides or the front, and that in turn will result in a 2.5x multiplier being applied to the impact damage, generally allowing you to take down the tank in 2 or 3 well-placed shots. Now this multiplier impact damage model, the one we just outlined for the Panzer IV, seems to essentially be the standard model, which is also applied to all the Pacific tanks, the Valentine tank and the AA variant of it, as well as the Panzer IV. The remaining tanks have their own respective models, with the Sturmgeschütz IV, Tiger and Churchill actually immune to any critical hits from the front, but very much still from the side and of course the rear, whereas the Valentine Archer is actually safest from the rear and most vulnerable on its side. Thus each tank is different in which parts of it are most vulnerable to critical hits or are even available for critical hits. In addition to that, it's also important to note that the current 1.6x multiplier for turret hits is basically completely disappearing. Thus, turret hits will have a flat 1x damage multiplier when update 5.2 rolls out. That means they're good to shoot at when only ricochets would otherwise be available on the body of the tank, but are no longer the go-to way to take out a piece of armor in the fastest way possible, other than outright flanking it and shooting it in the rear end. There is an exception to that, and that is in the Staghound and Panzer 30AT, essentially the light tanks, as they can still take more damage from turret shots, with the multiplier previously being at 1.67, but in the coming 5.2 update being reduced to 1.2. One last point as regards damage to tanks, the upcoming update will significantly reduce the slowdown to turret turning caused as consequence of a turret disable. Previously and currently, it's at 75%, and in the future, with update 5.2, it only will be 25%. Now, impact damage multipliers are of course only part of the equation. The actual impact damage, blast damage, and tank you are shooting at are further factors that impact how much damage you can actually do against a given tank. And thus, let's talk briefly about the tank shell damage changes. Essentially, damage changes to the tanks as they are in the game now. As regards the damage of individual shell types from the different tanks then, things have been rebalanced across the board, and if you want every single damage value, I recommend you check out the description for a link to Azura's Reddit post on the matter. He details all the changes with a relatively helpful series of tables. What should suffice to know for the sake of this video, however, is that AP shells have seen on average a 20% reduction in their impact damage, with the Sherman Calliope and Heat T shells for the regular Sherman being hit more significantly, respectively with a 32 and 43% nerf. On the other hand, most of the HE shells actually saw minor or even significant improvements to their impact damage. Those with the most significant buffs, obviously, are those who currently do very little in terms of actual impact damage, and thus while the difference between AP and HE shells will now be smaller, the AP shells still continue to be the clear better choice for engaging enemy armor. I also thought it would be worth mentioning that the LVT and Type 97 HMG variants, intended to be mostly effective against infantry and of course aircraft, will see their absolutely ridiculous damage output against infantry significantly reduced, going from a, as it stands right now, 2 to 3 bullet to kill to a 4 to 6 bullet to kill depending on the range. Further, the coaxial machine guns, essentially your secondary guns on all the tanks, will see their range effectiveness slightly improved, with their 4-shot minimum range now extended from its current 12 to 40 meters, and their 4-shot maximum range extended from 75 to 100 meters. Additionally, most HE shells will now see between an 8 and 14% increase in their blast radius. But what does all of this mean in terms of the changes to meta and the changes to gameplay that will occur as a consequence of this patch? Both as of course regards tank versus infantry, but also tank versus tank. Well, personally I find that while angling is set to become slightly less important for tanking pros, compared at least to the current model, the variety and viable options for maps not entirely dominated by infantry likely will be increasing thanks to buffs to the HE shells. Overall hits and damage differences should be more consistent and easier to read for players, both in tank battles and when engaging in anti-vehicular combat as infantry player. As Azura points out in his analysis, tank v tank gameplay is getting somewhat more consistent and understandable for the average player, but in turn somewhat less skillful for those who have already mastered it. For my part, I frankly appreciate the simplicity here, but absolutely understand those who are unhappy with it because they see it as some form of dumbing down of relatively complicated vehicle mechanics. To me, anti-tank weaponry does seem to be getting quite a nerf, which leaves me a little bit uneasy, though I think we need a little more info and possibly even gameplay experience as to how the Panzerfaust, 80 grenade pistol and Piat behave and what damage to typically expect from them against your average piece of armor in your average armor versus infantry engagement. I personally think more needs to be done to stop tanks from long-range camping and instead encourage them to push up with their teams and where possible even get on flags, but that is, as numerous people have pointed out to me, a relatively complicated matter to balance and not simply something achieved by making tanks harder to kill for infantry in close quarters. In summary, I'm somewhat cautiously optimistic for this aspect of the 5.2 update, though I will be waiting for the actual update to go live before passing my final judgment on this aspect of it. But that pretty much wraps it up for tank changes coming in update 5.2. Feel free to share your own experiences down below. If you enjoyed the video, a rating would be much appreciated. But with all that being said, I'd like to thank you very much for watching and hope to see you in the next Battlefield 5 video.